we're really optimistic that although, that you may see people travel differently than in the past, whether it's because of remote work or some of those climate goals, that overall the business is going to rebound. And we're really excited about that.
Good day, everyone, and welcome, and thank you very much for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara, co-president of Teneo Political Risk Advisory in New York City. So it's been now 20 plus months since the onset of COVID-19 changed the world, and few industries, I think, illustrate the economic, political, commercial, and human impact of the pandemic as much as the airline industry. Global airlines are estimated to lose over $200 billion between 2020 and 2022. At the same time, government support for airlines allowed them to keep flying, keep their aircraft fleets airworthy, and be ready for the recovery and to raise capital. Without such support, I think many airlines would have gone to 100% full stop. Then, when restrictions were started to be lifted, air travel came roaring back, at least in domestic leisure, if not in the all-important business sector as yet. Meanwhile, as we head toward COP26, which starts at the end of this month, sustainability is an issue, with aviation accounting for 2 to 3% of global emissions. The International Air Transport Association is committing to net zero by 2050, but this is a challenging industry to decarbonize. So to discuss the state of the industry, its prospects going forward, and their efforts to meet their climate targets, I'm joined today by two stellar guests. Calin Rovinescu is the former CEO and president of Air Canada. He's a lawyer by training. Calin also served as the chairman of the board of governors of the International Air Transport Association, IATA, and chair of the Star Alliance chief executive board. He is a director of Scotiabank and BCE, and he was named the 14th chancellor of the University of Ottawa. And he is also a Teneo Senior Advisor. And Amelia DeLuca. She is Delta Airlines Managing Director of Sustainability, a 15-year veteran at Delta. She's responsible for overseeing the company's long-term sustainability strategy and maintaining Delta's sustainability investments and partnering with government affairs and legal as the airline navigates this ever-changing regulatory and policy environment. So I'm delighted to welcome both Calin and Amelia to the call for the first time. So let's start. Good morning. Let's start with a bit of a level set here, I guess. I sort of laid out where we are, but I'd love to hear both of your diagnoses, if you will, of the state of the industry and the prospects as you see them now. So maybe Calin, we can start with you, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, Kevin, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I think that basically the number one thing that I'd say is that we've moved now from the state of this pandemic mindset to one of endemic. We recognize that this is around and it's here to stay, and we need to find a way to live and work with it. So what that means is that we've seen, in some countries, and the United States is a good example, some really good recovery over the summer. With enormous expectations for the rest of the year, and then of course we saw a bit of a pullback as the last variant of the virus took hold and sort of dampened some expectations. So the point is that airlines that have been sort of sitting on the sidelines waiting for the recovery have managed around it, have gotten themselves ready. And we've always said that this was going to be a sort of three-segment recovery, that leisure was likely to recover first because people wanted to go away. They've just had enough of this environment. They needed to travel or visit friends and relatives. And so that was the first part to recover. And the second part would be domestic travel, and then finally business travel. And we know that is the slowest to recover, and especially international business travel. And so, I think that airlines have been gradually preparing themselves for this. As you say, $200 billion plus of losses over the 3 years. But when I look at the numbers, 138 billion lost in 2020 for the industry, 52 billion in 2021, and the estimates for 2022 are 22 billion. So, you can sort of see that this is coming back, and undoubtedly we'll unpack a bit later the discussion around the recovery of business travel.
Sure. Thank you. And Amelia, what's your sort of starting basis here?
Well, I echo everything that Calin just said, and focusing on just Delta for a second, we had our earnings released last week, which was really positive. The mood here was incredibly optimistic. We had a profitable quarter amid the variant, so that demonstrates that we are set up, to Calin's point, to be able to weather this going forward, to figure out how to deal with the virus, which I think is a really positive sign of the resiliency and the perseverance of both our teams as well as the industry. And with revenue at 2/3 of the 2019 levels, that's exactly what Calin said. It doesn't exactly look the same as 2019. A lot more domestic leisure than we saw then. But that's great, and the rest of it will come over time. And then for me personally, I think the biggest marker is the fact that, I lead Delta's sustainability and ESG efforts, something that, quite frankly, we didn't talk about that much during the early part of the pandemic, rightfully so. Safety of our employees and customers was the number one priority. And then the financial security of our company, of course, was right behind it. But you're seeing now, anyone who reads the news now, we at Delta have this daily clips that kind of shows all the headlines of where Delta's at. And the month of September was just dominated by headlines on its sustainability as well as ESG. And I think that's a sign that everyone's feeling that, yes, there's still a lot of work to do in the short term to get the recovery where we want it to be and to accelerate it, bring our brand back, make sure we bring back the operation in the best way possible, but simultaneously feeling that urgency to look a little bit more medium and long term to really secure our future. Because if we figure out how to manage this recovery, but we don't have a plan for how we're going to handle climate change, how we're going to handle our social responsibility, well, then it will all be done in vain. And so for me, that is actually the best sign of optimism, is knowing that we're talking about these long-term topics again.
Yes, and we're going to certainly unpack that here in a few minutes. But I want to go back to something that both of you have now brought up. So I'm assuming that, so what we have seen is this incredible surge in domestic leisure travel. My understanding is that for the industry, it's basically at pre-pandemic, above pre-pandemic levels, in fact. So, Amelia, can you give us a status update though on where business travel stands right now? And I'm also curious about, as the U.S. borders are about to essentially reopen early next month, what are the expectations with regards to international long haul? I know, you just commented on Delta's earnings earlier in the week. I know United did as well yesterday, and one of the things that Scott Kirby was talking about was the balance of toward international on their sort of forward-looking expansion versus domestic. But how are you seeing those two markets playing out, domestic business and the international long-haul stuff?
So our business recovery was really positive quarter over quarter. So, and I will say, I just anecdotally, I had the opportunity to spend time 2 weeks ago with Delta's top corporate and agency customers in person in Atlanta. This was the first big in-person event that we have done since the pandemic started. And again, anecdotally, but the joy that those individuals had to be with their colleagues talking about business travel, the optimism that was in the room that day, the balance between the short-term needs to get, travelers comfortable again and to get policies in place so that, business travel can resume, but balanced again with that long-term of, what are we going to do to tackle climate change? It was really an exciting conversation that I think mirrors what the company has seen at a higher level. The statistics for the third quarter were the fact that we saw 40% of our business travel recovered, which was up 10 points from last quarter. And again, that was pretty positive despite the Delta variant. We know that business travel will recover. We know that it's going to look different. And there's a couple things that we know will look different. So one, remote work is going to make business travel look different. It may not be people traveling from their office out to clients, but perhaps traveling from their home to the office going forward by air. And I think that's something that we are, actively engaging with our corporate customers to say, how does this look differently? And also, what routes are you going to be flying? Because it may look different than the past. And I think you're seeing a lot of airlines, Delta included, position its route network to reflect where, people have relocated to during the pandemic. And then I think, secondly, you do have companies that have, overarching climate targets, and some of those start to set in at the 2025 and the 2030 level. But we also know that they're going to be growing their workforces, pretty dramatically. Some of our top businesses have projected some really strong growth of their FTEs. And so I think we're really optimistic that although, that you may see people travel differently than in the past, whether it's because of remote work or some of those climate goals, that overall the business is going to rebound. And we're really excited about that. And then I think, go ahead, Calin.
No, I was just going to say, I might add, Kevin, just to pile on a little bit on what Amelia is saying is that, a lot of people want to travel. I mean, exactly that, the anecdote that Amelia is sharing on that conference in Atlanta, we've seen that. I've seen that in many other companies that I'm involved with. One of the boards I'm on just had its first in-person board meeting with, the auditors and, all of the other advisors who needed to come came in person. There is certainly a pent-up desire to travel again. And I think that we're also, seeing the beginnings of many of the players in the financial services industry, starting to establish their policies and their practices for the coming months. So you are seeing a little bit of forward planning and figuring out how many people to have in the office at one time, et cetera. So it is different than it was last quarter for sure. And obviously part of this has to do with vaccination rates and other safety precautions. But at the same time, as far as the industry itself is concerned, there have been very, very, very few, like less than 1% of people who travel on airlines have tested positive. I mean, this is a statistic that IATA shared recently, and so it is materially less than the number of people who test positive who are sort of engaging in daily life. So I think that has now sunk in the more broad business community, financial services. So therefore, it is going to pick up. Is it ever? And this, here I will disagree with Bill Gates, who, came out of the blocks early on and said that, business travel is dead forever. Obviously, the stats that Amelia is sharing, proves to the contrary. It won't be quickly what it was in 2019, but there's no question that it's heading in that direction. And some segment of the community, of the business community, may well, keep remote working for a long time, especially some of the technology companies. But I would say that generally the recovery is, heading to well above 50% and moving in the right direction, would be my sense.
Yeah, do you think that, I would just say, anecdotally, I think you're absolutely right. Talking to colleagues and clients alike, there's this sort of almost joy of getting back to traveling again, even the travel that used to be thought of as a chore more than anything else. And of course, how many times have we heard that the last Zoom sales call will be the one that when you lose a sale to the guy who flew out to see the customer, right?
Right.
So, but Amelia, going back, you sort of alluded to this, that, and we're going to get to the sustainability of the industry in a little while here, but with regards to what your corporate customers are doing to meet their own net zero or sustainability targets, one of the things that is being discussed is cutting down on corporate travel, right? And so what are you hearing from your corporate customers on this front? And I guess when you add that all up, net, I know you're talking about the complexion of business travel is going to change, but net, will business travel, be as big a part of the revenue share as it had been?
I think so, and let me tell you a couple of reasons why, and we can come back to it later where I can go into the tools that are available to address business travel emissions, because I think that's really important. There's tools available today that corporations can use to adjust their business travel. We've seen corporations, even I think a couple of days ago, a major financial services firm came out and said, hey, we achieved our net zero target of 2025 now. And so that's because they're utilizing tools that are available to them today to be able to address their footprint. And that's, all elements, not only the emissions that are generated from the business, but their business travel. All of those have some real solutions today. But I think what we're finding, and I think this is kind of it was an eye-opener for me when I talked to our corporate customers last week about, okay, how are you addressing your travel policies today in light of the situation today with the pandemic, but also thinking about the future with climate change? And their point is exactly what you said there, Kevin. No one's going to put a strict policy in place that says you can't travel because of climate or you can't travel because of the pandemic. They're going to really focus on just be thoughtful of when you're traveling. Be thoughtful when you're traveling. And even another great example that came up was the example of rail in Europe came up. And so the question to our European corporate travel managers was, are you mandating rail? And their point was, it is so difficult for us to say that is the better decision for a lot of different reasons. Is it actually the better decision for the environment if you have to take a car to get there? Is it the better decision for their safety because of what Calin just mentioned, that air travel is actually one of the safest modes of transportation? Is it the best for their well-being and their mental health and their family time and all? There's so many elements that we've learned during the pandemic that we have to balance in how we kind of just live our day-to-day lives, including business travel. And so from that, I think business travel policies will be created to be incredibly flexible very employee centric and just putting and empowering those employees to make the decision. Do you really need to be there? And coming to your point though, Kevin, I think we'll know more in another year or two, because when we do get back to normal, I think we're going to start to see how some things just cannot be done in Zoom. We figured it out. It works great, but that human to human connection that our industry in particular is built upon just cannot be replicated over Zoom.
And to that, and it's more than, just our industry. I think that what some companies are learning, and a lot is now being written on that, and I'm sure that firms like Teneo are going to be at the forefront of this. The culture that an organization needs to build needs to largely be built with human interaction. And I've spent a lot of time building the culture that we built at Air Canada, and I can tell you we've not been able to build that culture through Zoom and these kind of alternative platforms, Blue Jeans and so on and so forth. This could not be done remotely, and I think that some organizations are going to take a bit of time to realize that. But I, for one, am a very, very big believer in that you build cultures through human interaction, not through video interaction. And I think people will get that. I mean, not everybody. I mean, obviously, we've still seen some of the tech companies that said, we're never going to come back to and if you're writing software in your basement, maybe that's okay. But if you're looking to build a culture, for an organization, I think that you're going to find it much tougher to do, even for smaller companies.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Calin, on that. But one of the other lessons of the pandemic has certainly been that we ought not to straight line any of our expectations, really, or we need a scenario plan for a variety of outcomes. And Calin, I'm interested to know what you think the state of the industry's resiliency is right now. Should we encounter, another variant that's highly transmissible or has, greater illness or greater lethality associated with it, in which borders start getting closed again, travel starts getting curtailed either for personal reasons or regulatory reasons, what's the state of the industry today to deal with another situation like this, especially if it happens, there will be other pandemics somewhere down the road, but if we have another one another variant in short order here where we get hit again, how do you see that? And I also want to segue this into something I know is very near and dear to your heart, which is industry government relations on this front in terms of that kind of holistic preparation for these types of events.
Sure, Kevin. Look, I think that is one of the most important questions that the industry faces, and one that has been the subject of tremendous amount of discussion amongst the CEOs in the industry. So let me start off by saying this: resiliency is absolutely bang on the correct word to use here. And this industry has shown itself to be unbelievably resilient in the face of this. And I go back to 9/11, which was obviously the other major shock to this industry, which is now, sadly, 20 years ago, and it still is horrific in the minds of so many. And the lessons that collectively we've learned, and we know that following 9/11 and following the consequences of 9/11, there were many insolvencies around the world. The entire North American airline industry restructured in Chapter 11 and the equivalent of Chapter 11, and it came back. And now it took a long time for it to come back, and it took a long time for the industry to become profitable following those 9/11 events. And I think that, you look back and you say there were some permanent changes that occurred in safety and security and in screening out of 9/11. And some of them were necessary at the time, and some of them stuck around way too long relative to what we needed to have to deal with that. So that is a kind of a lesson learned, and one not to do it this time around, right? And so this is the next major shock to the industry. Here we are 20 years later, and we have something that is, and I've said this publicly, multiples of 9/11. 9/11 is nursery school, kindergarten compared to this pandemic, and the level of losses and the duration of the damage is very, very significant. We're starting to see the recovery now, but this is very significant. So the industry has shown itself to be resilient not only in respect of its capital, that it was able to either rely on its own capital, like many airlines were able to do, able to raise substantial amounts of capital in capital markets, or in some cases have a buffer of support from governments, either through debt or equity or refundable loans and so on. So essentially liquidity was available to the strong carriers, and we know that there were a few carriers who disappeared, through the pandemic, but some of them, frankly, were not structured to survive. So the resiliency from a capital perspective was good, and largely, the government support was a buffer, and we're seeing it already starting to be repaid in many cases, and many of the Europeans are doing that. But beyond, when I look at resiliency, it means much more than liquidity. Resiliency goes to how quickly did airlines ground aircraft? How quickly were aircraft put in the desert? Pretty damn quickly. How quickly were routes changed, and how quickly was capacity taken out? And how quickly were costs taken out of the structure? Now, you can't take costs out quickly enough if you face an 80 or 90% reduction in your book of business. So the resiliency, this is an industry that is highly, highly, highly resilient. And so I have no doubts that it will survive the next pandemic as well. And obviously, the players in the industry may change, but this is a highly resilient industry. My only concern is whether some of the measures that are put in place today in response to the pandemic do not have a 20-year time frame, the way many of the constraints that were put in post 9/11 have still stayed around long after they could be replaced by technology and by other drivers like that. I might pause there to see if Amelia wants to add something, but then of course I think that the second part of your question is extremely important as well, is how have governments interacted with airlines through this piece, not only on the funding side, but perhaps more importantly on the reopening side, and how has that worked out? But I'll just sort of pause here.
Yeah, I want you to expand on that here in a second. So maybe, Amelia, anything you would add on this front?
A couple things. I think Calin said it incredibly well. He talked about 9/11. I'll just mention I joined the airline industry right out of college in the middle of bankruptcy. So I joined Northwest Airlines when they were bankrupt. And so you look at the cultures of these airlines are built to be resilient, just in how quickly we adapt, how people are created to think and to move about the airline, so that there's kind of a constant flow of innovation and being forward thinking and flexibility. Very, very agile. And I think about also what Calin said there about safety. I mean, safety has always been the number one priority for this industry. And we used to think about avoiding crashes, and then we thought about it, post 9/11 security. And now we think about it a little bit differently, but that'll just become an additional layer of safety that is part of how we travel going forward. And it's just as much internal as external. So we've asked the flying public to change how they travel. Inside airlines, we have also, again, taken stock of what have we learned in this pandemic. Delta hired a chief medical officer, for example. That's a great sign of us recognizing that this is going to be part of our DNA going forward. And it's a great part of it, honestly, because it fits under this umbrella of well-being of our customers as well as our employees. And again, it's kind of unfortunate it took a pandemic to force all of us to step back and really think about what's important in life, spend time with loved ones, talk about mental health. But there's a lot of good that has come out of this. And so I think you take a very resilient industry and you add on a ton of learnings from the last 20 months. And first off, there's no way we won't make it. But if anything, we will emerge much stronger, which to me is why people like myself joined during bankruptcy like Calin, and we stick around, even though it's not easy. We just love it. And so I think that's the only commentary I would add before we turn to government.
So that's a positive. Assessment right there. Calin, let's turn to government, where I know you're not going to give us high grades. So,
no, look, I think that's right. I think, I'm going to use a segue from something Amelia said, again, safety and security. Airlines are in the safety and security business. They've always been in the safety and security business. They may now be also in the health care business, but they've been in the safety and security business much more than governments have been in the safety and security business. That is sort of, in the DNA of airlines, and certainly of the most capable and well-managed airlines around. Safety and security is number one. So when you have a pandemic and response to a pandemic, the views, the impressions, the collaboration from airlines, is essential, including what airlines see on the ground. Like I can tell you from personal experience. We made the decision, we as Air Canada made the decision in January that we were going to stop flying to China, even though it was against our financial interests, because we were not comfortable purely and simply with what we were seeing on the ground over there. Our government at that stage did not require it, did not agree with us, frankly, did not think that was appropriate. Well, I still wonder to this day, had folks started taking steps immediately when we saw what we saw on the ground in January, not March 15th, but January, what consequences that would have had. So my number one beef with governments, and I don't want to single out any government because I think they're all culpable in this, the United States government, the Canadian government, all of the European governments, many governments in Asia and elsewhere around the world, is that there was not enough collaboration and respect for the fact that airlines are safety and security specialists. So therefore, the level of collaboration as to when to shut it down, how to shut it down, how to provide adequate requirements around sanitization measures and PPE, protective, what is the right timing, how to do it. It seemed that it was this constant battle in the early days as to what was needed, when routes should be shut down, when they should be reopened, what dynamics should be on board, what protocols should be in place. It's always like, a Sisyphus pushing the rock up the proverbial hill here. This is what we were facing. So one, lack of collaboration. Governments like to talk about public-private partnerships, in the context of infrastructure projects. This was an opportunity for a real partnership between industry and governments, and I think that governments largely have dropped the ball on that. Secondly, when it comes to this whole discussion around reopening, when we recognize that the aviation industry contributes something like 4% of global GDP, right? It's one of the biggest contributors to global GDP. Therefore, many economies depend on it, many regional markets depend on it. So therefore, you have to have a plan to deal with the reopening, in terms of how it should be done, when it should be done. Airlines cannot start. Delta had a very strong third quarter, as Amelia said, but the question was how quickly could they have ramped up relative to the restrictions being released. And so if somebody says we will plan to have the restrictions released on November 30, well, that allows airlines to plan for December 1st. If you only find out that November 30 is going to come around on November 21st, well, that doesn't help you. So,
right.
To the extent that there is a understanding of the complexity of taking an aircraft out of the desert, making sure it meets its maintenance requirements, ensuring that there are pilots who are current to be able to fly that aircraft, like all of these drivers. And so while I would give some governments around the world decent marks on being there to support the carriers in their respective countries early on in the pandemic, while I'd give some of them high marks as well for dealing with vaccination requirements and ensuring that large portions of the population become vaccinated, I do give good marks on that. I do not give good marks on collaboration or on having a sensible plan on reopening. Even right now, when we're dealing with vaccine passports, they're all over the map. Countries have got different requirements. Some within countries, you occasionally have different requirements. And so there seems to be a lack of coordination that is unnecessary here. And, hopefully we will have learned something from this going forward.
Yeah. Amelia, I want to ask you a quick question about your employees. And I know that, the industry, like all other industries, has taken a variety of measures to protect their employees and to protect their customers with a variety of strategies on vaccines and other elements. But as I was talking to people over the last couple of days in advance of this call, to a person, they all wanted to know how you're protecting your employees against, we have seen that gate personnel and flight attendants in particular having to play this sort of frontline role of enforcing the protocols that are either mandated by government or by the airlines themselves. And we've all seen the horrific videos of, air rage and all of this. How are you protecting them on that front as opposed to just the health front itself?
I think there's a couple things I would point to, and some of it starts at the very beginning of the pandemic when Delta took measures, as many airlines did, to make sure that their teams were protected, whether it was pay protection for COVID exposure or COVID diagnosis. In Delta's case, we ran the middle seat block the longest, more than any other airline, which is as much to protect our customers as it is to protect our employees. And so, as Calin mentioned, there was a lot of decisions that were made about how we fly that were, suboptimal from a revenue standpoint, but we're definitely putting in the forefront the safety of our employees and customers. And again, as we talked about, that's just kind of how the airline industry is built. Safety is at the core of what we do. It's our number one priority. But it looks different now, which is what you're alluding to, Kevin. When we think about safety, and we've talked about some of it related to the pandemic, and now we're talking about how do we manage through this time when there is a lot of divisiveness in some of the ways that we are approaching the pandemic. And there is a mental health crisis, certainly, that is out there globally that I think you're seeing kind of filter through to air travel. And so, again, I would just say that this is part of the DNA of the industry and part of the DNA of Delta. I do think one thing that Delta is doing that's going to help tremendously is adding 8,000 employees. Again, that may not be, the number one thing that we need to do in terms of financial resiliency, but that definitely helps support our customers through those trying times, takes away some of the stress, right? Some of the stress that comes from air travel right now is just because people have not traveled for a really long time. It looks very different, and there is just kind of no room for error. And so as we move into the holiday season in particular, we are preparing our teams. We've got those added resources. We are thinking and approaching it a little bit different in terms of making sure they are fully trained. They've got a lot of extra training to make sure that they're prepared for the way that this looks differently, but also just approaching, as we always have, through a lens of empathy as well as humanity. That, people, and a lot of people, especially when it comes to December, the December time period, are going to be traveling for the first time. And we're going to have international travelers arriving in the U.S. for the first time. And quite frankly, it's a little bit daunting, even as I'm going to COP26 in a couple of weeks. I'm going to Glasgow, and it's like, I haven't traveled internationally since the pandemic started, and I feel stressed about that. And so I think when you really kind of flip the narrative on it and don't come at it from the air rage narrative, but more about the fact of let's just continue to focus on Delta as a brand that is empathetic, and we are humans, and we approach it all through the lens of humanity. I think that's what we're doing to prepare our people going forward.
So, Calin, both you and Amelia have brought up 9/11, obviously one of the great inflection points for the industry, and we talked about the resiliency and the adaptation of the industry. But I would also say that flyers are pretty resilient and can adapt to changing conditions. We went from being able to meet our loved ones at the gate and just kind of walking onto planes to, everybody now just basically takes off their shoes and takes their laptop out at the security gate and doesn't even think twice about it. We have adjusted to a new environment. So what do you think are the sort of the long-term changes that the flying public is really going to have to think about, as this is just as the new normal when it comes to flying now?
Well, I think that the idea of ensuring from a health perspective that I think people will not fly, for example, if they are sick. I think that this is one of the things that both in terms of keeping yourself safe, but also not infecting others. You'd have this, proverbial, almost cartoonish environment where someone is sitting beside you in the middle seat and is coughing and sneezing and so on and so forth. I don't think you're seeing that. I think people will take responsibility for that. I think people will take responsibility for all of these testing protocols, whether it's COVID-19 or whether it's some other environment. They will, the digital testing that is now available, the number of testing organizations that have come up is available. So I think people will be much more responsible for their own health. Secondly, the whole entire sanitization environment, the level of cleanliness and care that airlines are bringing to bear on everything from you used to see statistics about the number of microbes on the trays that you serve food on. All of those, of course, now are sanitized to a very, very high level. That will continue well into the future. That's not going to go away with this going. The airline's not going to revert to the same cleaning protocols as before. That has both a cost in terms of additional people, but it also has a cost in terms of, the utilization of the aircraft, because of course the aircraft now is on the ground sometimes longer, and you'll see them occasionally at the gate a bit longer. But those protocols, in my view, will stay, which are good things to remain. The things that I'm concerned about are all of the various requirements that regulators and governments put in place, as I mentioned earlier. You talked about the fact that you'd be able to walk up to the gate with your loved ones. In some airports, your loved ones cannot now enter the airport, right? Like basically many of the airports, especially in Europe, unless you're traveling, you can't even set foot into the terminal. So things like that, I would say that when you look at that, or when you look at the various quarantine requirements, and if somebody was coming from a third country connecting through another country, that you might have a quarantine requirement, that you might have to be stuck in that connecting country for 14 days. So that some of these knee-jerk rules that have been put in place have to be obviously relaxed as soon as we're able to say that we're dealing with it adequately. But things around cleanliness, things around being mindful of your symptoms and testing if required. These things will stay around for some time. I think that there are a lot of technology companies that have come up with apps, so you can measure, your own oxygen rate, which of course everyone knows is now a big driver of this particular pandemic. There'll be other tools like that. So, you will see a greater focus on it, and that's net a good thing. But the regulatory requirements, I would say, I hope that they disappear on the first day that they should disappear.
Amelia, anything you would add on that front?
No, I think it was very well said. And I will just, on the personal level, I'll just mention, as a mom of 2 small children, I mean, I think some of these are welcome changes, to Calin's point, people not traveling when sick, people not being afraid to, say I'm sick and I'm not going to go to work, or I'm not going to send my kids to school. So again, kind of an optimist at heart, as you can probably tell you have to be if you're in the sustainability business. But I think that the changes that we're seeing, and many of them in terms of just how people travel, are really positive.
Okay, so you, Amelia, you mentioned that you're going to be leaving in a couple of weeks for COP26 in Glasgow, and as you can all see behind me, it is a beautiful summer day in New York. The problem is, of course, it's late October. So let's talk about sustainability and climate change for this industry, and maybe we can start by talking about what you in your role as heading up this sustainability effort, like as I mentioned at the outset, it's a challenging industry to decarbonize. It doesn't seem like there's any one single bullet that gets it done. So how are you prioritizing this, and what are you most focused on now?
Thanks, Kevin. Now you're in my wheelhouse, my passion area. The airline industry, my beloved airline industry, is also a hard to decarbonize industry. It is one of a handful of industries that are well known as not having, as Kevin says, that silver bullet. And so it's critical right now that we start to come together as an industry, but also across our whole supply chain, and just say, here's what we need to do. Because some of these solutions are things that will not come about until the 2040s or even 2050, which is our industry's net zero goal. And so that doesn't mean we sit back and wait, though. It just means coming out of this pandemic, there is just a heightened focus on just getting almost the house in order. And I don't mean that from a Delta perspective, because we've got a fabulous strategy that we're enacting on, but across the industry, saying, well, how are we going to work together differently? How are we going to approach this? How do we work with our trade associations? How do we work with IATA? How do we work with Boeing and Airbus? How do we work with our jet fuel producers, right? Like, they're all new relationships in this sense. And then you got a whole bunch of startups popping up for some of the new technologies. And so stepping back from Delta's perspective, we think about our world in 3 phases at this point. And so walking backwards, I mentioned net zero at 2050, of course, that is what everyone is striving for. That's why we're all going to Glasgow in a couple of weeks, is to talk about how, as a world, we achieve the Paris Agreement to keep our global warming under, or at the, under 2 degrees Celsius, but hopefully closer to 1.5 degrees Celsius, because obviously that's now accepted as the plan necessary to essentially save our planet. And so if you think about that, and knowing that there's a whole lot of solutions that are out there that we're not sure about, you start now to put research and development into those solutions. Electric battery, hydrogen, direct air capture, potentially new novel airframes, right? There's a whole lot out there. Those are where the research institutions. And then we've got sustainable aviation fuel, which I call that a medium-term solution, because it's actually available today. We just need more of it. And it's going to take us probably about a decade, I would say, to scale that to what is even an acceptable level, which the industries typically are aligned to, the countries. The majority of countries are globally were aligned with the goal of 10% sustainable aviation fuel at 2030. But there's a minuscule amount today. I mean, well below 1% of SAF that's available today. So there's a big effort right now working across to say, is there enough demand for producers to start to, whether it's major oil and gas producers, to actually convert their operations into sustainable aviation fuel, or for startups to be able to feel comfortable and to get the funding to be able to exist. And then the here and now, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
I was just going to ask if we could just pause for one moment, and maybe you could describe for the audience exactly what sustainable fuels are, what's the origin of them, And
Right.
and it's not you either are using Jet A or A1. You can there's blends, right, that you can sort of
Yeah.
increase over time. So can you just talk a little bit about what exactly a sustainable aviation fuel looks like?
Of course. And funny enough, at the meeting I had last week with some of our corporate customers, they were like, wait, are you saying there could have been sustainable aviation fuel on my flight today? I was like, yeah, if you flew out of San Francisco, there's actually a really good chance there was some on there today. And so to your point, Kevin, how does it work? So sustainable aviation fuel, it's at its easiest form, think of it as used cooking oil, though there's actually a whole lot of other sources for it today, from soybean used cooking oil, woody residue, inedible corn products, to the future municipal waste, which, God, if we could get that one scaled, that's like the holy grail for us. And so all of those different feedstocks essentially are, takes a little bit of extra energy to convert it into Jet A, but the whole life cycle of that, because you're not extracting, essentially oil out of the ground, has significant carbon emissions reductions. And so the way that it works today, sustainable aviation fuel can actually reduce the carbon intensity or the carbon footprint of a flight up to 80% if it was blended in its full form. Now, what you just mentioned, Kevin, just means today we don't blend, meaning you're never going to have an aircraft today that you are on that's got 100% sustainable aviation fuel, because it's not certified up to that right at this moment, but you can blend up to 50%, and that 50% can have an up to 80%. Sustainable aviation fuel, if you walk away with one thing today about this industry, is what you should be listening for and paying attention to right now. Because as I mentioned earlier, that's what allows our business travelers to be able to say, I have a tool that's available to me today to be able to reduce my carbon footprint. Now, again, there's not enough of it today to be able to hit everyone's needs, and it is actually very expensive. But this is one, and we can come back to in a second, where the alignment globally on the need for this and the support from the governments is actually pretty strong.
Right. And and it's interesting because you're talking about the different sources of the feedstock into sustainable fuels,
Mm-hmm.
right? That holy grail at the end of that was from recovered waste products, essentially, as opposed to further taxing the food chain,
Mm-hmm.
which has got other ramifications, competitively speaking, and environmentally speaking. The other thing I wanted to ask about the use of sustainable fuels, either in the blend that it's allowed to now, and how you see it in the future. Does it have the same impact in terms of wear and so on and so forth on the engines currently, or is that something that's evolving too as you deal with Pratt and GE and Rolls-Royce and the other major manufacturers?
So there's a lot of work being done to study it, because as I mentioned, there's not a lot of use of sustainable aviation fuel today, so it's kind of hard to be able to actually predict what other downline effects that there may be. I'll point out one positive. So I think to answer your question, Kevin, right now we do not think there's any impact on the engine usage, on maintenance, on anything like that. I'll give you another positive. I would throw out there for sustainable aviation fuel. It's still under development right now, but contrails, and if you don't know what that is, but let's say on a clear day, you look up in the sky and you see those white lines that come off of an airplane. Contrails are being increasingly studied and being linked to climate change as well. We don't know enough about the impact of it, but we're studying it right now. However, we do know that sustainable aviation fuel, when used, often will lead to not emitting a contrail. So that's like a double benefit to sustainable aviation fuel. It's still under review right now. We work with MIT on this right now, and we're doing a pilot on this as we speak. So sustainability, the name of the game is always you think you find a solution, and then it's kind of a system thinking, right? You got to think, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And so we're very early on in our journey. Every decision that we make, we do think about those downline impacts, but some things are still being studied as we start to scale some of them.
Calin, and I want to come back to some of the other sustainable fuels that you were talking about in a moment, Amelia. But Calin, one of the things I'm hearing here from Amelia, she's talked about R&D. She has talked about the higher cost before we scale up sustainable fuels. We've talked about. She also mentioned the hiring that's going on when we were talking earlier about the labor situation. And of course, R&D too, with lighter airframes, the conversations that are ongoing with Boeing and Airbus, and of course the engine manufacturers. What I hear is higher costs. I'm wondering, it's always been a wonder of this industry that for all of us, the cost of flying is something that actually, all things considered, has remained pretty cheap and not, we haven't seen the kind of price inflation we've seen almost every other good that we have consumed over time. And so, and with the low cost air carriers that used to prevail in Europe, it was cheaper to fly from London to parts of Europe than it was to get from central London to Heathrow in the first place. So are costs to travelers going to go up? I mean, it's been one of the most democratizing industries in the world. People have been able to travel freely at all levels of society. Is it going to become a more expensive thing to do? And from a climate perspective, is that maybe, should it be a rarer thing?
Right. Well, I know it's a great question. Look, I think that the answer, simply put, is yes. And you're seeing some governments, especially in Europe, actually encouraging airlines to avoid flying short haul, and in some cases mandating it for them not to fly short haul. And from a environmental perspective, as part of, in some cases, as part of the support through the COVID financing, they've actually required some airlines, and Air France KLM is an example, where they're mandated to not fly short haul flights, call it 100 kilometers or less. And so that, I think, will continue until such time as there might be, an alternative, perhaps the electrification of aircraft, which we might also mention in a few minutes, which is another one of the initiatives that exists in terms of the industry. So, I'm going to take a step back, though, Kevin, and just say, one of the things that the industry did, and we were the first ones to, amongst the global industries to do it, is establish an industry-wide protocol. It was somewhat of a response to the fact that governments were going to be implementing their own requirements, in a disorderly fashion, again, akin to what I was saying has happened during COVID. So what the industry did about a decade ago is work towards a global standard for international emissions. And so the industry has got targets, and part of those targets that have been worked out with ICAO. So this is the industry through IATA with ICAO, which is, of course, the international regulator of civil aviation, worked out something that's called CORSIA, which is basically an agreement for international emissions. And that has intended to recognize that some countries of the world have been polluting the world through aviation, if you like, more than other countries that are just at the early stages of it. And so, there was a sort of a fair sharing of that in terms of the growth in emissions over the next period of time. So, this question about low-cost carriers, the idea is, in some cases, low-cost carriers have definitely democratized flying, but in many other cases, they've actually put out into, from an emissions perspective, many emissions for, basically without paying their fair share. So this dynamic will be somewhat equalized through CORSIA. Now, one of the things that comes up is that every airline is going to have responsibilities to get to this 2050. One of the things that we were doing at Air Canada, and my colleagues there just announced this week, the fact that there's a partnership being set out with our corporate accounts, and Deloitte's was the first one that signed up, that they would actually select, to Amelia's point, select sustainable aviation fuels as their desire, and therefore pay more. And the program was called Leave Less, like sort of a play on the word leaf and less. But they would actually pay more to fly, recognizing that to fly has got a cost to it. It's got an environmental cost. And I think that is directionally where it's going, which is going to be tougher for some of the €5 fares from London to Greece, that sort of thing. That shouldn't be the case, because they're going to be contributing to the overall environment. The electrification of there are a lot of we're talking about R&D, but there are some actual projects going on right now, both in the 50 to 80 seat environment, as well as in some very, very small aircraft that are called these eVTOLs, which are the electric vertical takeoff and landing, sort of a modified helicopters for 4 passengers, all electric. And there's a lot of good work being done, and I think that we're going to see it sooner than later. And many players in the aviation space are investing or supporting some of these emerging players. I think we'll see something within the decade.
So I want to ask Amelia about that here in just one moment, but I want to go back to something you just said, Calin, and it goes also back to your conversation earlier about government and government relations with the airline industry. And obviously we're in the midst right now in the US of a massive infrastructure debate going on. But Air France, KLM Air France can have these negotiations with government about short haul flights and so on and so forth. In the United States, I feel, if you're somewhere in the Boston, New York, Washington corridor, depending on weather, time of year, et cetera, you can have a real debate with yourself about whether it's better to take the shuttle or to take the Acela. But you go 100 miles, try to go 100 miles in a different direction, and there is no public transportation. There is no rail or anything. The short haul flight is a lifeline in a way. So, the long-term planning of governments also is going to come into play here, right?
No, absolutely. No, I think Europe and some parts of Asia have got amazing rail connections, and I think that is something that we don't have in North America. And so I think the North American solution has to, by definition, involve some electrification of regional aircraft, and that is being actively worked on. There's some really good players who are. I think that is, from a sort of shorter term perspective, if we're talking about actually achieving something by 2030 and 2040 before 2050, I think that you're not going to build rail quickly enough for that, and I think some of that travel needs to occur. So you'll have some combination of electric vehicles and people avoiding those short haul flights. But I think the longer term solution will be electrification of regional aircraft.
So Amelia, for you, and running the airline that serves the routes that you do and I mean, Calin's brought up a lot about the electrification, the Teslas of the sky, I guess. And you brought up hydrogen earlier. And I guess I'm just, wondering, what are you doing and what's the industry doing on these fronts? And do you think, even looking at hydrogen as an example, right? I mean, is there enough energy density potential in the fuel, given the physics of aviation and all that, to actually make this stuff work in any kind of reasonable time frame? Where are you? We talked a lot about sustainable fuels. What about in these new fuel types?
Well, before I get there, I do want to go back to the question you just asked, Kevin. And I think one of the most important things that we can do right now as an industry, which we are doing, and Calin just mentioned a great one with Air Canada's new program, we need to give consumers the confidence to continue to travel now. Because we've got solutions that are out there, to your point. And one, some of these solutions just don't resonate with our consumers to begin with right now. Like electric sounds scary, hydrogen sounds overwhelming, sustainable aviation fuel, my mother-in-law always is like, doesn't that smell like French fries? It just doesn't resonate with them. And so the most important thing is to say there's solutions today that do resonate with them. Carbon offsets is one. Delta is a carbon neutral airline. And what that means is we've taken the first step in taking responsibility for our emissions today by bringing them down as much as we're able to through fleet accelerations and through operational efficiencies, and then through investing in avoiding deforestation throughout the world globally, which deforestation, as you mentioned earlier, the aviation industry is 2 to 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis. Deforestation is 15%. And so before we get to a future where we are flying electric aircraft or aircraft that are now run off of hydrogen, we should probably stop cutting down our trees. And so I think consumers connect with that because that to them feels like they can contribute the way that they recycle, right? It's not 100% perfect, but I'm able to make a difference by taking this action. And so what we find from our consumer surveys today, regardless of if you don't have rail or whatnot, is that consumers are like, can you just please tell me what you are doing, what the government is doing, and then how I can participate? But it's in that step function, actually. First, they want governments to do something, which is where I think it's kind of fascinating what we're seeing under the Biden administration is they're trying to get out there and take some steps to help through incentives. And then you've got what are corporations doing, which again, some corporations are addressing their business travel. Corporations like Delta, we are carbon neutral. And then they're coming up and saying, okay, and I would now like to participate. How can I participate and address my carbon footprint? And that's a beautiful setup, and that's how it should be, because we don't want people to stop traveling while they wait around for, all these solutions that frankly are going to take a little while. And again, may not resonate with them even in the short term. So then fast forwarding to what you asked about the future. So from Delta's perspective on all of these, they will all exist, right? We are not all in with one single thing, which is where I think you're going to see us strategically take a very wide lens. That's how Delta's kind of always operated. We're not going to be a carrier that's just this sort of a carrier for this sort of a customer with this sort of a fleet. Like we're kind of trying to focus on making sure we're diversified, whether that's through our revenue stream, through our customer bases, et cetera. Same thing for sustainability. And so you kind of think about what this looks like in the long term, and you think about you've got different sorts of lengths of haul. And then you've got different years over time. And Calin mentioned some. At some point for short haul, electric is going to pop up. At some point for medium haul, hydrogen is going to pop up. And then even at the 2050 period for that long haul, you're still going to be reliant on sustainable aviation fuel, which again gets back to the criticality of that tool today, because even I think IATA most recently predicted, I think 65% of what would be fuel consumption at 2050 would be from sustainable aviation fuel. And so getting that to scale as quickly as possible, because hydrogen and electric, while really cool, typically require a little bit of an overhaul in your system. You mentioned it, the density of hydrogen means that we're going to have to fly a little bit differently. That looks different. How you pipe hydrogen into planes is totally different. Electric is totally different, as Calin mentioned. Some of that's going to be super short haul routes that don't exist today, and you're kind of popping from these helipads into the airport, right? Beautiful, beautiful ideas, and I really hope they all succeed. But in the meantime, we've got to have additional solution that works.
Well, guys, I've got a lot of more questions on this front, but my one job here is to land the plane, so to speak, at the bottom of the hour, and here we are. So I want to thank you both very, very much, and hopefully we'll have you back as the industry evolves. Finally, today, I do want to acknowledge a longtime friend and senior advisor to Teneo and a guest on this program. General Ray Odierno. He was a 4-star general, the Army Chief of Staff, and a commander of U.S. forces in Iraq. He was always a pleasure to work with and to speak with. I learned an awful lot, and he was really an archetype. He was the true officer and a gentleman. Ray passed away 2 weeks ago at the age of 67, and Teneo's condolences go to his family, and he will be missed by his friends here at Teneo. Our next call will be in 2 weeks' time on November 4th. We're going to continue our series of looking at how corporate America is achieving diversity in its senior ranks. So please look out for the invitation for that call. So Calin Rovinescu and Amelia DeLuca, thank you so much for joining us today. Learned a lot. We covered a lot of ground, and there's more on all of that. So again, hopefully you'll come back, and thank everybody for joining me today. All the best for the weekend. And until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a good day.